The torrential rain fell on New York City like a shroud, blurring the neon signs into watercolor ghosts against the wet asphalt. Eleanor, her coat soaked through, stood shivering at a desolate bus stop, the strap of her worn satchel clutched in a white-knuckled grip. A group of men had materialized from the shadows, their laughter a harsh, grating sound that closed in around her. One stepped forward, his smirk glinting under the street lamp, blocking her only path. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She held his gaze, her chin lifted in a silent act of defiance, refusing to let them see the terror that threatened to swallow her whole. But what happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter her world. And if you watch until the end, you'll understand why it was both a rescue and a condemnation. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about the lines we cross when we have nothing left to lose. Eleanor Vance was 28, a woman who lived her life in the quiet, hallowed halls of the city's grandest library, where she worked as a restorer of ancient books. Her days were a meticulous ritual of mending torn pages and reinforcing fragile spines, a silent communion with stories that had outlived their authors. This devotion to preserving the past was her shield against a present defined by solitude. Orphaned by a tragedy that stole her family and left her adrift in a sea of debt, she had learned to be invisible, to move through the world without leaving a ripple, her dignity the only inheritance she fought to protect. Her workspace was a small, cloistered room in the library's archives, a place that smelled of aging paper, leather, and the faint, sweet scent of bookbinder's glue. Yet this sanctuary was also a prison. Her supervisor, a man of petty cruelties, wielded his minor authority like a weapon, piling on extra work and making comments that chipped away at her resolve. The oppression was quiet but constant, a low hum of anxiety that followed her home to her small, empty apartment. She felt trapped not by walls but by circumstance. Her life a delicate manuscript she was desperately trying to keep from falling apart completely. The world outside her quiet corner was a symphony of muffled sounds, the distant echo of footsteps on marble floors, the soft rustle of turning pages, the low murmur of voices from the main reading room. These were the sounds of her loneliness. She found a fragile peace in the tangible reality of her work. The smooth, cool feel of vellum under her fingertips, the precise weight of a finishing tool in her hand. These small, controllable details were an anchor in the chaotic undercurrent of her fear, a constant worry about rent, about illness, about the sheer, overwhelming weight of being utterly alone in a city that never slept and never cared. Despite her vulnerability, Eleanor's moral compass was unyielding. She saw the world in stark, simple terms of right and wrong, a clarity forged in the injustice of her own past. She was the one who would return a lost wallet, its contents untouched, even when her own was nearly empty. She was the one who would stay late to help a flustered colleague, expecting nothing in return. This innate sense of justice was her strength, but also her most profound weakness. It made her unable to comprehend the shades of gray that governed the world of power and influence, a world whose orbit she was unknowingly, inexorably being pulled into. That evening, as the storm gathered its fury outside the tall arched windows of the archive, an unfamiliar tension settled in the air. A sleek black sedan, its polished surface reflecting the distorted city lights, had been parked across the street since late afternoon. She had noticed it earlier, a silent, imposing presence that seemed entirely out of place in the academic tranquility of the neighborhood. She dismissed it as a fleeting curiosity, but as she packed her satchel to leave, a cold premonition traced a path down her spine. The familiar silence no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like the held breath before the lightning strike. The morning light struggled to pierce the grime on Eleanor's small apartment window, casting a pale, defeated glow across the room. Her world was a collection of worn, second-hand things, each object telling a story of necessity rather than choice. The alarm clock's insistent buzzing was the day's first assault, a mechanical summons to a life lived on someone else's time. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her routine a silent ballet of survival, brewing cheap coffee, pulling on the simple, dark clothes that served as an unofficial uniform, and checking the dwindling contents of her pantry. The city hummed outside, a vast, indifferent machine, and she was just one more cog preparing to be ground down by another day. Her daily commute was a lesson in anonymity. Pressed against the cold glass of a crowded city bus, she watched the grand architecture of New York slide by, a world of gleaming towers and untouchable luxury that felt more like a painted backdrop than a real place. Around her, the faces were etched with the same quiet exhaustion she felt deep in her bones, a shared, unspoken understanding of the chasm between their lives and the city's glittering promise. She would often lose herself in a book, its papered world a temporary shield against the press of bodies and the scent of damp wool and weary resignation, finding more kinship with fictional characters than the living souls beside her. The great public library was both her refuge and her cage. As she stepped through its massive bronze doors, the chaotic noise of the street was replaced by a hollowed silence, a cathedral-like calm that settled over her. In the archives, surrounded by the scent of aging paper and leather, she felt a sense of purpose. Her hands, stained with ink and glue, moved with a surgeon's precision, mending the wounds of time on centuries-old manuscripts. Here, she was not just a survivor. She was a guardian of stories, a preserver of beauty. It was in these quiet moments, with a fragile page resting in her palms, that she felt the closest to being whole. This fragile peace, however, was perpetually threatened by Mr. Davies, her supervisor. He was a man whose authority was confined to the library's basement archives, and he wielded it with a petty, corrosive cruelty. He would loom over her shoulder, his breath smelling of stale coffee, pointing out imagined flaws in her meticulous work. His praise was a currency he never spent, but his criticism was dispensed freely, his voice a low, needling drone that aimed to chip away at her confidence. She endured it with a stoic silence, her posture straight and her gaze fixed on her task, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The pressure extended far beyond the library's marble walls. A framed photograph on her nightstand showed her smiling mother, a woman whose long illness had left Eleanor with a mountain of medical debt. Every paycheck was a frantic calculation of what could be paid and what would have to wait. The threatening red letters on overdue notices a constant source of anxiety. This financial burden was a chain, tethering her to the job she endured, silencing any thought of leaving or fighting back. She carried this weight alone, a secret shame that isolated her further, making her feel like an imposter in her own life. In rare, stolen moments, Eleanor allowed herself to dream. While restoring a medieval atlas, her fingers would trace the coastlines of distant, sun-drenched lands. She imagined a life of warmth and color, a place where the sky was not framed by brick and steel, where her time was her own. It was a silent, internal rebellion, a fantasy of escape that kept a tiny flicker of hope alive within her. This secret world, rich with unspoken desires, was her most prized possession, a place where she was not defined by her limitations, but by the vastness of her own quiet, resilient spirit. The grand clock in the reading hall was a constant, imposing presence, its heavy pendulum swinging like a metronome counting down the moments of her life. The hours stretched, each tick an echo of her confinement.
She would watch the wealthy patrons drift through the halls, their lives seemingly unburdened by time or money, and the contrast was a physical ache in her chest. They saw the library as a place of leisure and intellect, a beautiful ornament in their lives. For Eleanor, it was the front line of her daily battle for survival, its quiet halls a constant reminder of everything she was not and might never be. Despite the hardness of her life, her capacity for empathy remained untouched. She was the one who would notice a junior archivist struggling with a difficult binding and quietly offer guidance, sharing her knowledge without any need for acknowledgement. She'd leave a part of her meager lunch for a stray cat that lived in the alley behind the library, a small gesture of kindness in a world that had offered her so little of it. These acts were not for show. They were an instinct, a fundamental part of her character that refused to be extinguished by the coldness surrounding her, a testament to the light she guarded within. That afternoon, the cruelty she had learned to anticipate finally struck. Mr. Davies, eager to impress a visiting benefactor, publicly admonished her for a supposed error on a priceless manuscript, a microscopic tear he had likely caused himself with his careless handling. He spoke in a hushed, condescending tone, ensuring the benefactor heard every word of her supposed incompetence. The humiliation was a hot flush that spread across her cheeks. As punishment, he ordered her to stay after hours, unpaid, to repair the damage. Her protest died in her throat, silenced by the cold, hard reality of her dependence on him. As the library emptied, the silence that had once been her comfort became oppressive, magnifying her solitude. The great halls were filled with long, ominous shadows, and the ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, mocking her. She worked for hours, her hands trembling slightly, her spirit feeling as frayed as the ancient paper she mended. When she finally finished, the city outside was being consumed by a violent storm. Stepping out into the lashing rain, she saw the last bus pull away, its red taillights disappearing into the deluge. She was alone, exhausted and utterly exposed, standing on a dark corner as the world dissolved around her. From the drowning chaos of the storm, a new silence emerged, sleek and predatory. A black sedan, polished to a mirror finish that warped the bleeding city lights, glided to a stop.
It didn't just arrive, it materialized, a solid piece of the night detaching itself from the shadows. Its presence was so absolute, so commanding, that it seemed to bend the very air around it. The men harassing Eleanor faltered, their crude taunts catching in their throats as they turned toward the vehicle. The car was an omen, its engine a low, imperceptible hum that was more felt than heard, a vibration of immense and disciplined power held in perfect check, waiting. The rear window descended with a whisper, revealing an interior of deep, luxurious shadow. Seated within was a man, his form a sharp silhouette against the dim cabin light. Julian Thorne. His name was a ghost on the lips of judges and a prayer on the tongues of his enemies. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, his hands resting calmly in his lap. He paid no mind to the men on the sidewalk. His entire, unnerving focus was fixed on Eleanor. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, were not merely looking at her, they were assessing, cataloging her soaked coat, her defiant chin, her quiet terror. A palpable chill, colder than the rain, radiated from the car. The men, who moments before had felt like kings of this dark corner, now seemed to shrink. Their bravado dissolved under that silent, unwavering gaze. It was a gaze that promised nothing but consequences, a look that had seen and orchestrated violence so profound that their petty threats felt like a child's game. One by one, without a word spoken, they backed away, melting into the alleyways they had emerged from. They didn't run, they retreated, like scavengers chased from a kill by a far more dangerous predator whose territory they had unwittingly entered. Only then did Julian speak. "Get in." The words were quiet, a low baritone that carried no inflection of a request. It was a statement of fact, a command delivered with the calm certainty of a man who had never been disobeyed. The sound cut through the noise of the downpour, landing with an impossible weight. For a heartbeat, Eleanor remained frozen, caught between the immediate, thuggish danger that had just vanished and this new, sophisticated threat that had taken its place. His eyes held hers, and in that moment she understood that refusing was not an option. It would be a greater risk than accepting. Climbing into the car was like stepping into another dimension. The heavy door closed with a solid, insulated thud, sealing out the storm and the city entirely. The air inside was warm, dry, and smelled of rich leather and something subtle like cold rain on stone. The silence was absolute, a living entity that pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart. She sat stiffly on the plush seat, her wet clothes a stark violation of the pristine interior. He was a universe away from her, a figure of immense, untouchable power, and she was now, for this moment, a captive in his orbit, moving through the city in a silent, armored bubble. He didn't speak again, simply put the car into motion, its movement as smooth and silent as its arrival. Eleanor gave her address in a voice that was barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window in front of her. The city slid by in a blur of fractured light and shadow, a world she recognized but which now felt alien and distant from the strange sanctuary of the car. Her mind reeled, trying to process the sheer improbability of the moment. Who was this man? Why had he stopped? The questions circled endlessly, but she dared not voice them, instinctively understanding that in his world, questions were a currency she couldn't afford. In the rearview mirror, their eyes met for a fleeting, charged instant. He saw more than a drenched, frightened woman. He saw the exhaustion of a life spent fighting small, relentless battles. He saw the unyielding steel in her spine, a form of courage he hadn't encountered in his world of broken men and calculated loyalties. And she, in that brief glimpse, saw something beyond the cold, controlled facade. It was a flicker of profound weariness, a shadow of an old, deep wound behind the impenetrable calm of his gaze. For a second, he was not a monster, but a man marked by his own darkness. When they arrived at her modest brownstone, he brought the car to a silent stop. He didn't just pull over, he waited, his gaze sweeping the darkened street, ensuring it was empty and safe before he turned to her. He reached into his coat and produced a simple, heavy stock business card. It was stark white, bearing only a string of numbers. No name, no title. He held it out to her, his fingers long and steady. "If this city disrespects you again," he said, his voice the same quiet, unyielding tone as before, "call." The word disrespects hung in the air, a term of his world implying a violation of an unspoken code. She took the car, her trembling fingers brushing against his for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a spark of ice, a jolt that seemed to travel straight to her core. She managed a small, almost imperceptible nod before pushing the door open and stepping back out into the rain. The cold hit her immediately, a harsh reminder of her own world. The car door closed with that same solid final sound, and without a backward glance, the sedan pulled away from the curb, its red taillights disappearing into the deluge, leaving her standing alone on the wet pavement, the strange, heavy silence of its
Presence still ringing in her ears. Inside her apartment, leaning against the door with her heart hammering against her ribs, Eleanor looked down at the card in her hand. It felt impossibly heavy, a tangible piece of a world she knew she should never have touched. The warmth from the car lingered on her skin, a phantom sensation that was both comforting and terrifying. The street outside was empty again, the rain washing away any trace of the men or the black sedan. But something had been irrevocably altered. A line had been crossed.
The silent, imposing presence of the man in the dark suit remained, an echo in the quiet of her room, a promise of a danger far greater than any she had ever known. The days that followed were a study in forced normalcy. Eleanor tried to bury the memory of that night under the familiar weight of her routine, treating the heavy cardstock in her drawer as a figment of a rain-soaked dream. Yet the city felt different, as if a filter had been lifted, revealing a layer of shadows she had never noticed before. The low hum of a luxury car engine would make her heart leap into her throat. A glimpse of a dark, tailored suit in a crowd would make her breath catch. She told herself it was paranoia, a lingering echo of fear. But deep down, she knew it was something else. The silence he had left behind was not empty. It was watchful, a palpable presence that clung to the edges of her quiet life. Her world, once a small, predictable orbit between her apartment and the library, began to feel porous. One afternoon, while taking her lunch on a bench in a small park, she saw him. He was across the square, exiting a formidable stone building flanked by men who moved with a coiled, disciplined energy. He didn't look in her direction, yet she felt his awareness of her like a change in atmospheric pressure. He paused for a moment, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear, before disappearing into the back of another black sedan. The encounter was fleeting, perhaps a coincidence, but it left her hands trembling as she tried to unwrap her simple sandwich. The city was no longer a vast anonymous space. It was his territory. A week later, it happened again. She was in a small, dusty bookstore in a neighborhood far from her own, searching for a rare edition for a library project. As she reached for a volume on a high shelf, a shadow fell over her. She turned, and he was there, standing in the narrow aisle, examining a leather-bound copy of Dante. He wore no coat this time, just a dark gray suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the shop. He offered no greeting, merely a slow, deliberate nod. The air grew thick, charged with the unspoken history of their first meeting. She felt an irrational urge to flee, but his stillness held her captive. It was no longer a coincidence. It was a pattern, a silent, unnerving courtship of observation she could not comprehend. Eleanor tried to reinforce the walls around her life. She varied her routes home, avoided the park, and ate her lunch in the staff break room. It was a futile effort. She felt his presence not as a physical threat, but as an invisible tether. She would look up from her work and feel a sudden chill, a certainty that she was being thought of, watched over. Her fear, sharp and immediate that night in the rain, was slowly transmuting into something far more complex and unsettling. A deep, unnerving curiosity. Who was this man who commanded silence with a glance, who moved through the city's underbelly with such effortless authority? And why had he fixed his attention on her, a woman whose life was the very antithesis of his own? He, in turn, found himself drawn to the quiet rhythm of his existence. From a distance, he watched her mend a book with painstaking care, her brow furrowed in concentration. He saw her leave breadcrumbs for the pigeons in the library courtyard, a small, unconscious act of grace. These simple, honest moments were like a foreign language he was desperate to understand. In his world, kindness was a weakness to be exploited, and trust was a commodity to be bought and sold. Yet her quiet dignity and unwavering moral clarity acted as a mirror, reflecting the man he might have been, the parts of his own soul he had long ago buried under layers of violence, power, and calculated control. The pull was a gravitational force, defying his logic and discipline. He had built an empire on emotional detachment, on the ability to see people as assets or liabilities. But Eleanor was neither.
She was an anomaly, a variable he could not quantify. Her innocence was not naivety. It was a form of strength he had never encountered, a resilience forged in solitude and hardship. He started to see his own reflection in her loneliness, a different kind of isolation from his own, yet born from a similar wound of loss. Protecting her had started as an impulse, a flicker of a forgotten code, but it was quickly becoming an obsession, a desperate need to shield this one point of light from the darkness he commanded. Their next encounter was in the hollowed halls of the library itself. He was there as a potential benefactor, touring the archives with the museum director. Mr. Davies fawned over him, his voice slick with sycophantic praise. Eleanor, working at her station, felt his eyes on her long before she looked up. When she did, their gazes locked across the cavernous room.
The director was speaking, but Julian wasn't listening. He was watching her, his expression unreadable but intense, a silent conversation passing between them that no one else could hear. In that moment, surrounded by the silent history of ages, she felt like a page in a book he was slowly, carefully reading, his focus absolute and unwavering. As he passed her workstation, he paused, ostensibly to admire the manuscript she was restoring. Mr. Davies began to explain its significance, but Julian cut him off with a subtle, dismissive gesture. He leaned closer, his proximity sending a shiver through her. "The spine is delicate," he said, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "It requires a steady hand." His fingers brushed against hers as he pointed to a fragile section of the vellum. The touch was accidental, fleeting, yet it felt like a brand, a spark of heat that shot up her arm. It was the briefest of contacts, yet it held the weight of 1,000 unsaid words, a fragile bridge between their two irreconcilable worlds. She felt a blush creep up her neck, a mixture of fear and a strange forbidden warmth. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a fragrance of cold steel and winter air. He held her gaze for a second longer, and in his eyes she saw it again, that flicker of deep, profound weariness, a fracture in the marble facade. It was a glimpse of the man behind the myth, a prisoner in his own kingdom of shadows. The moment was broken by the director clearing his throat, and Julian straightened up, his mask of cold authority snapping back into place. He moved on, leaving Eleanor with a racing heart and the phantom sensation of his touch lingering on her skin, a dangerous, indelible memory. The internal conflict raged within her. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at her to run, to disappear, to sever this strange, invisible connection. He represented everything she stood in opposition to, a world built on fear, violence, and moral compromise. Yet she could not deny the pull she felt. It wasn't just fascination. It was a dawning recognition of a shared solitude. She was beginning to see the profound loneliness that cloaked him, a desolation that mirrored her own. This realization terrified her more than his power, because it made him human, and it was the human part of him, the wounded part, that she was beginning to feel an impossible and dangerous empathy for. For Julian, the struggle was just as fierce. Allowing himself to feel anything for her was a betrayal of every rule that had kept him alive. Emotion was a liability, a weakness his enemies would exploit without hesitation. He was a man who controlled every aspect of his environment, yet he could not control the effect she had on him. She was disrupting the cold, precise machinery of his life, introducing a chaos he found both infuriating and intoxicating. He told himself his interest was purely protective, a debt owed for a moment of shared vulnerability in the rain. But he knew it was a lie. He was drawn to her light, even if he believed his own darkness would inevitably extinguish it.
The tension between them became a living thing, an unspoken current that flowed in the spaces they shared. Silence, once a comfort to Eleanor, was now charged with his presence. A lingering look from him across a crowded room felt more intimate than a touch. She started noticing the small things. The way his hands, always perfectly still, would clench into a fist when he saw her supervisor speaking to her. The way he would ensure his car was parked down the street from her apartment late at night. A silent, unseen sentinel. She was caught in his orbit, and while she feared the inevitable collision, she found herself unable and perhaps unwilling to break free. He began leaving small, anonymous gifts. A rare pigment she needed for a restoration project would appear on her desk, with no note to explain its origin. A first edition of a book she had mentioned admiring in the dusty bookstore would be delivered to her apartment, left on a plain brown package. They were gestures of a man who listened from the shadows, a man who could acquire anything in the world but did not know the simple language of direct courtship. Each gift was a golden thread in the web he was spinning around her, pulling her closer, making her complicit in a relationship that existed entirely in glances, silence, and subtext. She never acknowledged the gifts, and he never sought thanks. It was their silent contract. To speak of it would be to make it real, to give a name to the dangerous thing growing between them. She continued to receive them, her heart a battlefield of gratitude and terror. She was accepting favors from a man whose hands were likely stained with sins she couldn't imagine. The moral clarity that had once been her anchor was becoming clouded. Right and wrong were no longer simple, stark lines. They were blurring into shades of gray, distorted by the undeniable humanity she saw in a man the world considered a monster. The oppressive atmosphere with her supervisor, Mr. Davies, worsened. Emboldened by Julian's visit and the attention from the board, Davies grew more brazen in his cruelty, seeing Eleanor as a target for his frustrations. He began to single her out, his comments turning from professional criticism to personal insults.
He would block her path in the narrow archive corridors, his presence looming and invasive. She endured it with her usual stoic silence, but the fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She felt cornered, her sanctuary violated, and the weight of her solitude pressed down on her more heavily than ever before. One evening, as she was preparing to leave, Davies confronted her in the deserted archives. The main library was closed, the halls empty and echoing. He backed her against a towering shelf of ancient books, his face contorted in a sneer of petty power. "You think you're special, don't you?" he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "Thinking your important friends can protect you." He reached out, his hand grabbing her arm, his grip tight and bruising. Panic flared in Eleanor's chest, cold and sharp. The silence of the library was no longer a comfort. It was a tomb, swallowing the scream that was trapped in her throat. Suddenly, the heavy oak door at the end of the aisle swung open with a soft, definitive click. Julian Thorne stood there, a figure carved from the evening shadows. He wasn't breathing heavily. He hadn't run. He had simply appeared, as if summoned by her terror. His eyes, cold and flat as polished granite, were fixed on Davy's hand on her arm. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. The raw, predatory stillness that radiated from him was more terrifying than any overt threat. Davies froze, his face draining of all color, his hand dropping from her arm as if it had been burned. In that suffocating silence, Eleanor knew that a line had just been crossed from which there was no return. Julian moved, not with haste, but with the deliberate, inexorable grace of a shadow detaching itself from a wall. Each step on the cold stone floor was silent, yet it echoed in the cavernous space like a drumbeat,
counting down to a final judgment. He did not look at Eleanor. His entire being, every ounce of his lethal focus, was aimed at the trembling form of Mr. Davies. The air crackled around him, thick with a controlled violence that was far more terrifying than any shouted threat. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane, a promise of absolute annihilation held in perfect, disciplined check. Davies, pinned by that gaze, seemed to shrink, his petty authority dissolving into the pathetic residue of pure animal fear. He stopped a mere foot from Davies, invading his space without a single touch. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, resonant whisper that carried more weight than a roar. "You have touched something," he began, the words precise and cold, like chips of ice. That was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership that stunned Eleanor to her core. He paused, letting the implication settle in the suffocating silence. "You will leave this place. You will not collect your things. You will not return. Your existence in this city, as you have known it, is over." He took a slight step back, a gesture of dismissal as final as a guillotine's fall. Davies didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled backward, stumbling over his own feet, his face a mask of ashen terror. He didn't dare look at Eleanor, his eyes darting toward the exit like a cornered rat seeking escape. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him, the sound of its latch clicking into place, echoing through the archives with a deafening finality. The threat was gone, expelled from her sanctuary. But in its place was a new, far more profound silence, one that was now filled with the immense, dangerous presence of the man who had just dismantled another man's life with nothing more than a few quiet words and the sheer force of his will. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Julian turned to face her. The cold, predatory mask he wore for the world was gone, or perhaps it had merely cracked, revealing something raw and unguarded beneath. In his eyes, she saw not the satisfaction of a victor, but the deep, weary cost of his power. He looked tired, the kind of soul-deep exhaustion that comes from a lifetime of carrying a darkness too heavy for one person to bear. He had broken his own cardinal rule: never intervene, never expose himself, never act on emotion. And he had done it for her. In that moment, he was no longer a myth or a monster. He was just a man, exposed and vulnerable in the aftermath of his own transgression. He took a step toward her, and this time Eleanor did not recoil. Her fear was still there, a humming wire beneath her skin, but it was overshadowed by a powerful, inexplicable current of connection. She remained perfectly still, her back pressed against the ancient, silent books, as he closed the distance between them. He stopped just before her, his height and presence a formidable shield. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her arm, the spot where Davy's fingers had bruised her skin. The air grew thin, charged with 1,000 unspoken questions, 1,000 dangerous answers. She held her breath, waiting for a verdict she didn't understand. With a tenderness that seemed utterly incongruous with the man he was, he reached out. His fingers, long and cool, gently brushed against her skin, tracing the faint red marks left by Davy's grip. It was not a lover's caress, nor a gesture of possession. It was something far more elemental, an act of seeing, of acknowledging her wound.
The touch was a quiet apology for the world's ugliness, a solemn vow that it would not touch her again. It was a spark in the vast, cold darkness, a point of contact that grounded her, even as it sent her world spinning off its axis. He was claiming responsibility for her safety, and in doing so, binding her to his dangerous world forever. The simple, fleeting contact was an emotional cataclysm. It shattered the last of her defenses, not with force, but with an impossible gentleness. Looking up at him, she saw the truth laid bare. The violence he commanded was not random. It was a tool, a terrible and precise instrument he wielded to impose order on a chaotic world. And in that moment, he had used it to protect her. A wave of profound, aching empathy washed over her, drowning out her fear. She saw the profound loneliness of the man who had to be a monster to survive, the prisoner of the very throne he had built for himself. He was not just her rescuer, he was a casualty of his own war. For Julian, the touch was a revelation and a self-inflicted wound. The feeling of her skin, so fragile beneath his fingers, was a stark reminder of the chasm between their lives. He had spent decades building walls of ice around his heart, and with one simple protective act, he felt them beginning to fracture. He had brought his darkness into her sanctuary of light and order, contaminating her world with his own. The fierce, possessive instinct to shield her was now at war with the devastating realization that he was the greatest danger she would ever face. He had saved her from a petty tyrant, only to expose her to an empire of violence. The guilt was a cold, sharp blade twisting in his gut. He slowly withdrew his hand, though the ghost of his touch lingered on her skin like a brand. The space between them hummed with the energy of what had passed, a silent, irrevocable contract that had been signed in a moment of shared vulnerability. He had revealed his humanity, and she had not run from it. She had seen his darkness, and she had met it with a quiet, unyielding strength that he had never known. They were no longer a powerful man and a frightened woman. They were two solitary souls who had recognized the shape of their own loneliness in the other, standing together in the silent heart of the storm. They stood there for a long time, surrounded by the sleeping stories of centuries, caught in a new story of their own making. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The quiet that enveloped them was no longer empty. It was dense and heavy, filled with the weight of his transgression and her acceptance. Everything had changed. The line between their worlds had not just been crossed, it had been erased. And in the profound, echoing silence of the empty library, they both understood, with a terrifying and absolute certainty, that there was no going back. The door clicked shut, and the silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier and more absolute than before. Julian was gone. Eleanor stood frozen, her back pressed against the unyielding spines of 1,000 silent stories, the air still tasting of ozone from the storm of his presence. His scent, a cold and clean fragrance of winter and steel, lingered in the still air of the archives. She slowly raised a trembling hand to her arm, her fingers tracing the skin where his had been. The spot tingled, not with pain, but with the phantom memory of his touch, a gesture of impossible tenderness from a man made of violence. Her sanctuary had been defended, but in the process it had been irrevocably breached, its quiet sanctity replaced by the echoing ghost of his power. The next morning, Mr. Davies was simply gone. No official announcement was made, no explanation offered. His office was cleared out by midday, his nameplate removed from the door. A quiet, nervous woman from another department was assigned as the interim supervisor. Eleanor's colleagues, who had once barely noticed her, now watched her from the corners of their eyes. Their whispers followed her down the marble corridors, a rustling sound like dry leaves. They didn't know what had happened, but they knew it was connected to her and to the powerful, silent man who had visited the archives. She was no longer invisible. His protection had become a brand, setting her apart and isolating her more profoundly than her loneliness ever had.
From the panoramic window of his penthouse office, Julian Thorne watched the city breathe its cold electric life into the night. He felt a rage directed entirely at himself, a cold, precise fury for the lapse in control, for the emotional indulgence that had led him to her. By stepping out of the shadows, he had not saved her. He had merely illuminated her as a target. In his world, any perceived attachment was a weapon to be used against him, and he had just handed his enemies the most perfect, innocent weapon imaginable. The thought of her being used as leverage, a pawn in the brutal games he plays, was a physical sickness. He had to sever the connection. He had to become a ghost to her, to erase himself from her life completely, for the singular purpose of keeping her alive. The days stretched into a week, then two. Eleanor's life returned to its familiar shape, but the substance of it had changed. The silence in her small apartment was no longer a peaceful refuge. It was a hollow ache, a space defined by his absence.
She would find herself pausing by the window, her gaze scanning the street below for the telltale gleam of a black sedan that never came. The business card he had given her sat in her drawer, a heavy, tangible piece of a door he had closed between them. It was a constant, painful reminder of the man who had appeared in the rain, shattered her world with a quiet command, and then vanished, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any storm. The ripples of Julian's intervention spread through the city's underworld. Whispers of his uncharacteristic, personal involvement in a trivial matter became a currency of speculation among his rivals. They saw it as a crack in his armor of cold detachment. To quell the rumors and reassert his dominance, Julian orchestrated a ruthless corporate takeover, dismantling a rival family's front business with a bloodless, surgical precision that was more terrifying than any street war. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a public performance of the monster he needed to be. Each calculated move, each merciless decision was a stone he placed on the wall he was building back around his heart, a desperate effort to bury the man who had touched her arm in the quiet of the library. Weeks turned into a month. Eleanor sat by her window, watching a cold autumn rain streak the glass, the city lights dissolving into a melancholic blur. The sharp, immediate pain of his absence had begun to dull, transforming into a deep, resonant clarity. She finally understood the true nature of his world. His power was not a shield, it was a prison, for him as much as for his enemies. His act of protection, which had felt like a rescue, was also a glimpse into the profound desolation of his existence. Her empathy for him deepened, but it was now a sober, painful thing, stripped of any romantic illusion. He was a man drowning in the very darkness he commanded, and she knew, with a certainty that ached, that to reach for him would only be to drown alongside him. He could not let go completely. His influence moved like a ghost through the periphery of her life. An official letter arrived one day, informing her that the entirety of her late mother's crushing medical debt had been paid off by an anonymous philanthropic fund. A few weeks later, she was offered a significant promotion at the library, head of the Rare Manuscript Preservation Department, a position of respect and security she never thought possible. She knew these were his actions, his way of watching over her from an unbridgeable distance. Each gesture was a kindness that felt like a wound, a reminder of the man who could move mountains for her but could never again stand in the same room. Elenana's dignity, the one thing she had always fought to protect, demanded a response. She accepted the promotion, knowing her work had earned it. But she went to the hospital and, after weeks of quiet persistence, arranged to repay the anonymous donation. She set up a monthly payment plan, sending the money not back to the fund, but to a small inner-city youth charity, a place of light he would never touch. It was her silent answer, sent out into the void. It was a declaration that she was not a project to be managed or a debt to be settled. It was her reclaiming her own story, asserting the unbending strength of her own moral code in the face of his immense, shadowy power. Miles away, in the silent, leather-bound interior of his car, Julian read the brief report from his accountant. He sat in the darkness a block from her apartment, the rain tracing patterns on his windshield, obscuring her window from view. He had expected her to accept his help passively. He had not expected this quiet, fierce act of defiance. A slow, unfamiliar feeling spread through his chest, not anger, but a profound, aching respect. The very quality that had drawn him to her, her unbreakable moral spine, was the same thing that made a life with him impossible. She would not bend to his world, and he could not ask her to. It was the final, painful proof that the only way to truly protect her was to let her go. He put the car in gear and drove away into the rain, knowing he would never come back. The seasons turned. The silence in Eleanor's life solidified, no longer an absence, but a new state of being. The constant low-level fear that had shadowed her for years was gone, replaced by a quiet strength she had not known she possessed. Yet sometimes, late at night when the city was asleep, she would stand at her window and look out at the vast constellation of lights. She would think of him, a ghost in a black sedan, and wonder if he was looking at the same sky. The connection between them had not been severed. It had simply changed form, becoming an invisible scar, a silent, shared memory of a storm, a rescue, and the impossible human heart of a man in darkness. 2 years passed, the seasons turning with a quiet, deliberate rhythm that mirrored the new cadence of Eleanor's life. She was no longer the woman who lived in the margins. As the head of the library's preservation department, she moved with a newfound confidence, her voice carrying a soft authority in the hushed halls that had once been her prison. Tonight, she stood at the library's annual fundraising gala, a figure of understated elegance in a simple, dark blue gown. The great reading room was transformed, bathed in the warm glow of chandeliers, the air filled with the murmur of cultured voices and the clinking of crystal. She held a glass of champagne, her posture straight, a woman who had finally, painstakingly, restored the frayed and torn pages of her own story. She felt it before she saw him, a sudden, familiar drop in the atmospheric pressure of the room, a subtle shift in the air that was as distinct as a change in the wind. It was a sensation she had not felt in years, a ghost memory that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. Her gaze, calm and measured, lifted from the conversation she was in and began a slow, deliberate scan of the grand room. She swept past the city's elite, past the politicians and philanthropists, searching for a shadow she instinctively knew was there. And then she found him. He was standing alone on the mezzanine balcony, partially obscured by a marble column, a solitary figure in a black tuxedo, watching the proceedings below with a detached, sovereign stillness. Their gazes locked across the gilded chasm of the ballroom. The noise, the music, the laughter, it all faded away into a distant, muffled roar, leaving only a profound, vibrating silence between them. 2 years vanished in that single, sustained look. He saw not the frightened, rain-soaked woman he had pulled from the street, but a queen in her own right, poised and unbreakable, commanding her own small kingdom of beauty and history. And she, in turn, saw past the formidable myth of Julian Thorne. The coldness in his eyes was still there, but it was tempered now by a deep, resonant melancholy, the look of a man who had won 1,000 wars, only to find himself utterly alone with the ghosts of his victories. In his eyes she saw the silent admission. His greatest act of power had not been dismantling her tormentor, but in having the strength to walk away from her. He had protected her not by shielding her, but by trusting in the light she carried within herself.
It was his penance and his redemption, performed in the shadows, with no audience but his own conscience. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture so small the rest of the world would have missed it. It was not a greeting nor a farewell. It was an acknowledgment, a concession. It was the final, silent word in a conversation that had begun on a stormy night, a confession that her quiet, moral world had left a permanent, indelible mark on his soul. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he stepped back, dissolving into the deep shadows of the balcony. He was gone. The spell broke, and the glittering sounds of the gala rushed back in, filling the void he had left. Eleanor took a slow, steadying breath, her fingers tightening for a moment on the stem of her glass. A single hot tear escaped and traced a slow path down her cheek. But it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of a profound and painful grace. The story had found its end. She turned back to the warmth and light of the party, her shoulders squared, her heart both broken and, for the first time in a long time, completely whole. Their connection was a testament to the fact that some bonds are not forged in proximity, but in the silent recognition of a shared wound. He was the darkness that had shown her the true strength of her own light, and she was the light that had given his darkness a reason for redemption. It was a love story written entirely in the spaces between words, a silent, sacred thing that would forever exist in a quiet library archive and a single shared look across a crowded room. Their story reminds us that even in the deepest shadows, humanity can find a way to bloom. If you felt the weight of their silent goodbye, show your support by liking and sharing. And tell us in the comments what you believe his final, silent gesture truly meant.